Am I a co-host? Let's just check. I Can you make me a co-host, please, Waleed? Thank you. You are. I am indeed. Everything is working perfectly. So, ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, and assembled company, it is Friday, so therefore it is Louis night. I mean, it is stories for children, and tonight, all the way from the west coast of Ireland.
No, from the
southwest, southwest.
No, I'm Cork. I'm right at the south tip.
So,
By y'all.
okay, but yeah, okay, south. So, yeah, I know it's cool. I spent time there, but I generally travel down the west coast to get to Cork. At least that's my excuse. Right. So from the south, from the south, but on the western side of the south coast, then.
Yeah.
So I'm close. Anyway, that's irrelevant. We have stories for young persons and older bearded gentlemen, and whoever else is watching and listening and on YouTube or Vimeo or whatever you're working on. And we have the magnificent, the extraordinary, the amazing Maria Gillen. Over to you, Maria.
Hello and welcome to Rain in Cork. I was just talking to Louis and he said where he is, there's rain, but there's also sunshine. And when you have rain and you have sunshine, you have beautiful rainbows. And Louis said that he had to drag himself away from a most magical, beautiful rainbow to be here at Stories. So I hope these stories are worth it, worth abandoning the rainbow. So I promised Louis that the first story that I would tell tonight would have a rainbow in it. And here's the story. It's a story that comes from Cork in the very south of Ireland. And it's very, very old. It's a very old story. Once upon a time, on a farm in the beautiful south of the country of Ireland, there lived a boy, and he had a great time. He'd get up in the morning, Louis, and he'd run off out into the fields with his little dog, and they'd dance through the fields, and they'd be full of fitness, and they'd shout to the sky. And sometimes the birds would sing back from the sky, and they knew that was going to be a good day. But in this country, there could be a lot of rain. And we know that when rain comes, that eventually the sun will peek through. And when it does, beautiful rainbows come. And when the rainbows come, we all know that they spring from the magical gold pots in the ground. It is the only time when the She show off their front door. She is the Irish word for the fairies that live in the land. So this day, as the boy was walking through the field, there was a beautiful rainbow, and he was just next to where it started. Have you ever been where a rainbow started or ended? Well, he was at the part where it started. So he knew the magic words, which was suis, suis, up, up. And he sat at the end of the rainbow and the rainbow took him right to the other end and he found the end of the rainbow. Now we all know that at the end of the rainbow is the pot of gold, but clinging to it, holding on to the pot of gold, was a little leprechaun, a little man of the She, and he was holding on to it for dear life, and he said, not my gold, please don't take it, it's all that I have. And the little boy said, listen, I'm after finding the gold, and I know ye have plenty, and I need it. I need the gold because there's a hole in our roof and the rain comes through. And the little leprechaun looked up at him and said, please don't take it. And he was hanging on to it. And the boy knew that if he took his eyes off of this leprechaun, that he would never ever again find the gold. And just at that moment, the sun came out and it dried up all the rain and the gold became invisible again. But he was still sitting there holding on to something, and then he put his hands down and he started to walk away. Now, the legend says that if you take your eyes off of the that's it, they'll disappear. So he kept his eyes on him and he said, I'm going to keep my eyes on you, little man. And the little man ran to the right and he kept his eyes on him, and he ran to the left and he kept his eyes on him, and he started running in circles and he kept his eyes on him even though he was getting really dizzy. And the little man said, look over there. But he didn't look over there. He kept his eyes on the little leprechaun. And he walked up to him and he caught him by the collar and he started to fight and he started to shove his hands out and his legs out and he started to scream, and still the little boy held on to him because he had heard all the stories that if you took your eyes off him or if you let him go, that was it. You'd never see him again. So eventually he said, okay, what do you want? And the little boy said, you know what I want. I think the little boy's name was Louis. You know what I want, little man? You have to tell me, he said. It's in the rules. I wish to have your pot of gold. All right, said the man. It's over there. And he said, I'm not going to go without you. And he held on to his collar and he brought him over towards the tree and he looked down towards the roots. And indeed, he did see a little glint of a gold coin from between the roots of the trees, and a big fat tear slid down the face of the little leprechaun. He said, he sniffed, oh my goodness, but I have nothing to dig it up with, he said. I have nothing to dig it up with. Have you a shovel? And the leprechaun kind of brightened up again and he said, no, but sure you can come back. And how will I find the tree? He said. Wait a minute. And he pulled off a little red scarf that was around his neck. A little leprechaun's red scarf. Sure, it was only about that size when it was fully unfurled. And they tied it around a twig in the tree. And he skipped all the way home and he was singing songs to himself and all. A vaca to my vocaline, my 14 og, my hay machine. A vaca to my vocaline. It's igual she is on bow her. Woo, 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 he said to himself. And then he got home and he opened the door. And we all know the noise a door in a story makes. You open the door and it goes... And he enjoyed that sound. And then he went in and he got the shovel and he ran out, leaving the door open. And he found the field with his tree. And he saw a tree with a little red scarf there. And he saw another tree with a little red scarf there. And he saw another tree with a little red scarf there. And he threw his shovel on the ground and he said, that leprechaun, he fooled me. But he dug at all those trees anyway. He started to dig into the roots of every one of those trees. And he's an old man now. And he's still digging in that field. He's still digging at the roots of that trees. But you know what he found? He found that when you dig around the roots of the trees, that they give better fruit, that they grow stronger, that the trees seem happier. So maybe he got a treasure in a different way. What do you think? What do you think? Mwah! And that is my rainbow story, and it's really old, and that's for Louis because he went out today and he saw a magnificent rainbow, but he still came here. Now, in February of this year, before all of the storytellers in the World Storytelling Cafe before they went off to Morocco to meet one another, to hold hands and sing songs in the streets of Marrakesh, we had a bit of sad news because my grandaunt, the sister of my grandmother, well, she passed away, but she was a great age. She was 103 years old, and her name was May Conroy, and she came from Laois in the Hart County of Ireland, right in the middle of the island of Ireland. There's a small little county called Laois, and it's full of stories, and it's full of magic and myths. And when we went there, they reminded me of some of the stories that my grandmother would tell me when I was very small. And here's one of those stories. There was a granny called Ellen, because Ellen was the name of my grandmother. And one day, 2 of her grandchildren came to see her. Now, she had 9 children, and they all had 5 or 6 kids each. So her house was always full of children. But there came a time when they had other things on, when the house was empty, and people forgot to call to their granny. Never forget to call to your granny, because they get lonely. And she was getting lonely until one day she got a visit from Maria and Pádraig. My name is Maria and my older brother is Pádraig, and it may or may not be about us. So they went up to visit their granny, and they went off out into the back of her house. And she said, there's a grand field to run just at the side of the house there. It's shared by all of these houses of Grana Braher in Cork City. And they do say that it's magic. But there's part of that field, and it's a fairy fort. Whitethorn trees grow there. Nobody digs there, because it belongs to the she people. It belongs to the fairy folk. Maria and Pádraig were like this. Does it, Granny? Does it belong to the she folk? It does, she said. So whatever you do, don't pick the flowers in that part, because they belong to the she, and they must never, ever be brought into our small little house. Okay, Granny, said the 2 children. But Maria, she had big problems listening. 2 of them, and 1 of them, her mother used to always say to her, 2 of them for listening and 1 of them for talking. So you need to use them twice as much as you use that. Do you understand me now? But, Ma'am, listen, 2 of them. Okay, Mom, she'd say. Well, she went to the field and she was picking buttercups and dandelions and bullets and all sorts of other gorgeous wild flowers. Purple ones and yellow ones and blue ones and green ones and red ones, and all the ones that you can think of. All these gorgeous, gorgeous flowers. But then Maria noticed that the flowers up on the hill that was called the Fairy Fort, they were thicker, they were juicier, they were more colourful than the flowers that were in the field in Grana Braher. Oh, she said. Do you think she stayed away from the fairy flowers? Of course she didn't, because if she did, there'd be no story. She crept closer and closer and closer to the fairy flowers, and then she plucked one, and it gave a satisfying when she picked it, and she thought, oh, the other flowers don't make a noise like that. And then she examined this gorgeous flower, and she said, it's perfect. Every leaf is exactly the same width, and it's the most deeply coloured purple flower I've ever seen. And then she picked another one, and it made another lovely noise. And she said, that's the most gorgeous buttercup I've ever seen. It's like a buttercup that has gold in it. And she held it up to her chin to see did she like butter. But she couldn't see because she had no mirror. And then she was thinking, do I like butter or don't I? And then she thought, I'll ask my granny. So she put it with the rest of the bunch of flowers and she ran home to her granny's house. Now her brother Porrick, he'd been watching her and he thought, oh, and he thought, I better tell Granny before she gets into the house. But he couldn't run as fast as his sister Maria. She ran in through the front door. Granny, look what I have. And her grandmother said, that's the nicest bunch of flowers I've ever seen in my life. Look at the colours of them. Isn't it amazing? The bounty of nature. It's amazing, Granny, the bounty of nature. And Granny put them into a jam jar and put them up on the table and said, the stew will be ready soon and we have beautiful flowers to eat our dinner around. And just at that moment, Porrick ran through the front door. Granny, he said. What is it, boy? What's wrong? Granny. She plucked them from the fairy hill. Tell me you didn't, said Granny. And for the first time, Maria felt something different. What was that? She felt guilty. She felt wrong. She felt she should have listened to her granny. She said, I'm sorry, Granny. Take those flowers out now, she said. They can't be in the house. So Maria took the jam jar and she ran outside and she put it on the windowsill and Granny came out and she said, She, I hope you didn't see. She, I hope you didn't see. I think you all need to help me with this one. Ready? She, I hope you didn't see. She was hoping that they didn't see that the flowers had been inside the house for a certain amount of time. But with that, the fairy flowers drooped inside in the jam jar. And Granny went, oh my goodness, what's going to happen now? And Maria fell down on her knees and she said, She, please don't hurt me. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. She, please don't hurt me. And she went in home and they actually had a lovely day. They had gorgeous stew. They had Granny's apple tarts. And Granny used to put a little bit of clove into the apple and it would taste like Granny's apple tart. Like no other apple tart in the world. Like Granny's special apple tart. And there was cream to go with it on this day. And then before they went to bed, Granny had ice cream and jelly. And Maria thought, maybe they listened to me. Maybe they listened to me. But she took off all her clothes and she put on her night clothes. She put on her dressing gown. She went down to kiss Granny goodnight. And then she went back up the stairs, took off her dressing gown, pulled back the covers of the bed. And you know the way when you're in your granny's house, you take a jump into the big comfortable bed. Well, that's what she did. She went, whoa, and jumped into the bed. And she wasn't in it 2 seconds before, wah! She jumped out of the bed again. Because all nettles started growing in the bed. And they started to bite her on the bum. And they started to bite her on the shoulder and on the neck. And she started screaming, Granny! Granny, she said! Granny! And Granny ran up the stairs. What is it, Maria? She said, there's nettles in my bed. And Granny pulled back the covers. And she couldn't see any nettles at all. And she said, get into bed now, Lana. Go on, get into bed, Alana. And she pulled back the covers of the bed. And Maria looked in and she thought, well, maybe now that Granny's pulled back the covers, maybe the bed will be safe. And she jumped into the bed, but a little bit more slowly this time. And she jumped out really quickly. She said, Granny! And Granny could see the nettles disappearing off the sheets. And she said, oh, Alana, this bed has been hexed by the she. You better come in with Grandad and me. So she put her into the middle of the big Granny's bed that they'd had for years and years and years. And it was all soft and had feathers in it, and normally it was such a treat. But this night, as soon as Maria got into the middle of the bed, nettles started to grow, and they bit Granny and Grandad and Maria on the bum, and all three jumped out of the bed. Well, every bed that Maria got into, there was nettles in it, and she walked around the house, and she was very tired. Can you imagine it? Can you imagine having no sleep for 3 nights? Well, on the third night, there was a big full moon up over Cork City. They call it the full fat blue moon. There's only one in the air, and it's near the winter. And Pádraig, he sneaked out of bed, and he had a little fadog, a little tin whistle with him, and he walked up to the fairy field, and he could see that the moon was just over the hill where the flowers were. And the flowers looked even more beautiful, even more magical, even more mystical, even more attractive in the moonlight. And he could feel his own hand going out, and then he remembered what had happened to Maria. We all remember, don't we? We'll never forget. So he took out his little fadog, and he was waiting, because you have to be polite. You can't play over the fairies. And they were playing their fairy music, and they were dancing around. And as soon as they stopped, he started to play an old tune, a slow tune, a hypnotizing tune. And all the she looked up at him with their glistening eyes, watching, and he could see that their ears were listening. And when he finished, they clapped their tiny hands and they danced a dance of joy. And they said, "Can we keep that tune? Will you give us that tune?" "I will," he said. "And what do you want from it? Do you want gold? You can have fairy gold. Do you want riches? Do you want gems? What would you like?" And he said, "Only one small thing, for you to take the curse of the nettle from my sister's bed." "Oh," said the fairy king, "because if you offer something, then you have to be able to give it." And Pádraig had tricked him. And the king said, "I don't want to take it off." And he said, "Please, please, she has had no sleep in 3 nights. And when she doesn't sleep, none of us sleep. Believe that." "I believe that," said the king. "She's one of those kind of children, all right." "Okay," he said. "The hex is gone." "Is it?" said Pádraig. "And what about sleep? Will you ever sleep again? Will she ever trust the bed again?" And the king said, "Go home now, for she's sleeping the sleep of the innocent. And you better hope that she keeps it that way." But she did keep it that way, and she never went near the fairy hill again. And when her granny told her stories of the she used the 2 of them and none of them. And that's my story. I hope you liked that story. I really loved that story. What did you think, Louis? Do I get a thumbs up? 2 thumbs up. Oh, that's amazing. And all the fingers as well. Mwah, mwah, mwah. Well, you always know when you get a seal of approval from Louis, because he listens to so many stories, that your stories must be good. And that story is as old as the Leash Hills. And I heard it from my granny when I was a girl. And I remembered it when I was up at her sister's place in February. So that's the story of the nettles in the bed. So you better mind your fairy mounds. So let me see, what story will I tell next? Tonight I seem to be telling stories that are not my own stories. They seem to be the stories that I've heard. And maybe I'll carry on with that. Recently, after I came back from Marrakesh, I went to the radio station up in Dublin. Hello to the Joe Duffy Show and to all of the people that treated us so well. We had cream cakes and sandwiches and tea and a big open fire and fantastic stories. And there was a girl there called Helena Byrne, and she told a version of this story, but it's very different to the version I'm going to tell you. And you know, isn't that fantastic about stories? Isn't it brilliant that they cross the seas and they cross time and they cross space and they're still remembered? That's why it's important to tell the stories. That's why it's important to listen to the stories and to hear the stories. And this is my Cork version of a story that Helena Byrne told, and she said it came from County Tipperary. There was twin brothers. One was as happy as the day was long, and the other was as cranky as the night is long. One fella, his name was called John, and the other fella, his name was called Sean. That meant that their mother was a very intelligent woman, because it's the same name. John is the English version of Sean. So really, they shared the same name and they looked exactly the same. Unfortunately, both of them were born with a little hump up on their back. If that happened today, it would be no problem because our doctors are amazing. But this was a long, long time ago, and the two of them were kind of bent forward a small bit. John didn't care. He sang songs anyway, and he told stories. But Sean said, "Why did I have to have this when nobody else seems to have it?" And John would sing when he'd get his breakfast in the morning, and Sean would say, "Stop singing, you're making me cranky." So the mother said, "Listen, John, you get up a little bit earlier because you're a morning person. And Sean, you get up a little bit later because you're not a morning person." "All right, so, ma'am," said Sean. "All right, so," said John. And so it was that they grew up. And then they used to have a different day in a pub in Cork. Now, the name of that pub is Crawford and Company, and you can see it in Anglesey Street in Cork City. And if you go into that pub, you can see the two stools that belonged to the two brothers. So come to Cork. Come and I'll show you where these brothers would sit for their pints. And they lived in the centre of Cork City. And on Thursday, John would go to the pub and he'd sing songs and he'd tell stories and everybody loved him and the pub would be full. But on Friday night, Sean would go into that pub and he'd sit up at that bar and he'd have a face on him like a slapped something, really cranky. And he'd ask for his pint and nobody wanted to sit next to him. So nobody went out on a Friday night. Can you imagine? Nobody going out on Friday night. That was a long time ago. Loads of people go out on a Friday night in Cork City now. So anyway, one beautiful moonlit night, it's always a moonlit night when the magic happens, John went for his little pint in the pub and he sang so many songs and he told so many stories that his pint didn't even have 2 sips out of it and it was time to close up. And you know, when you've had a really lovely storytelling session, when you've sang your heart out, when you've danced all around the ground, and you know when you don't want to go home. Well, it was a night like that. And he thought, if I go home now and I'm so happy in myself, John will get really cranky because I'm bound to wake him up, because I'm bound to be more noisy when I'm happy. I might sing as I'm going in through the front door. And with these thoughts in his head, he turned up the hill towards the Loch of Cork. There's no rhyme or reason to the Loch of Cork. It's a big body of water in the middle of a city and loads of birds live on it. There is swans and ducks and all sorts of birds, and loads of people walk round and round the loch. It has a kind of a magical draw, and that's during the day. But this was the night time, and as he was climbing the hill towards the loch, he could see the old stone wall that's still there to this very day. And he was kind of touching the stone, saying, God, that feels a bit magical. That feels as if somebody from the magical place put up that wall. And as he was thinking that to himself, he heard, na 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 na. And he thought, oh, I think that's magic music. And then he listened more closely and he heard, De Lewin de Mort, De Lewin de Mort, De Lewin de Mort. And he thought, that's definitely magic music. And he thought, I want to go home. And he turned to go home, but his legs wouldn't let him. His legs started walking him towards the lock and he thought, oh. And then he listened and he took out his pipe and he was smoking on his pipe and he was listening to the music. De Lewin de Mort, De Lewin de Mort. And he thought, that's beautiful. But when you've heard it 20,000 times, De Lewin de Mort, De Lewin de Mort, De Lewin de Mort, De Lewin de Mort, it kind of loses its magic. And he thought, that needs something. No, that definitely needs something. What is it needs? And he listened again and he heard, De Lewin de Mort, De Lewin de Mort. And then there was a gap. And in Ireland, if there's a gap, you get in on the gap. You get in with a story or a song. And he was used to the session. So he waited and he was listening and he heard, De Lewin de Mort, De Lewin de Mort. A bit of a silence and then he went, De Lewin de Mort is de Cairdean. De Lewin de Mort is de Cairdean. And then he was delighted with himself. He thought, that's after improving it. But next of all, out from behind the wall, he saw a tiny face. It was about that size, looking up at him. And then hundreds more, all up the wall, all up on top of one another, all blinking at the same time, as if they'd agreed to blink at the same time. And he said, oh, and they said, yay! And they said, rish, 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 which means again, again, again. And you don't say no to the fairies. So he went, I'm delighted you liked it. And he cleared his throat and he said, De Lewin de Mort, De Lewin de Mort, De Lewin de Mort is de Cairdean, which in English means Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Oh, they loved it. And they put the come hither on him. The come hither is when you want to go one way, but your legs are drawn the other way by the person saying, Tarcuim, Tarcuim. And you just can't say no. It means, come to me, come to me. And he started going to them, floating towards them. And he said, oh, please don't drown me in the loch. I can't swim. But just as he got to the edge of the loch, with the moon shining down, the waters parted. And he saw stairs appearing. And they went down, 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 down. And he thought to himself, that's amazing. I never knew there was stairs under the loch. And then he found himself floating towards those stairs and down, down, down those stairs until poof, he was at the bottom. And the king of the fairies, Rina She, isn't it beautiful in the Irish language, the king of the fairies? Rina She. Will we all try it? Are you ready? Rina She. That's it. When he saw Rina She, he bowed the knee, because you have to give dues to the fairy king. And the fairy king was delighted with how polite he was. And he said, John, we're delighted with you. And John said, oh, thank God, because I was afraid that I was after overstepping. And he said, no, we've been singing that tune for 10,000 years and it's never changed. And John thought to himself, De Lewin de Mort, De Lewin de Mort, for 10,000 years? Oh my God, it would drive me mad. But he said nothing because he was polite. And he said, oh, I'm delighted that you got an extra bit. And he gave a big smile. And the king of the fairies said, we're going to give you something. What would you like? Would you like gold? Would you like jewels? Now here's the secret. If they ever ask you that, know that they love their gold and their jewels. Know they won't want to give it to you. Know that you should ask for something else, like long life or health or something like that, and then they'd be much happier with you. That's just a hint in the middle of my story. Now, John knew that. So John said, I don't have much need for anything. I'm happy as I am. I sing songs all day long. And Rena, she said, we know. We see you singing songs all day long. And John kind of got a bit happy with hearing that from the king of the fairies, that he was known to be a happy man. He says, there you go. He says, sure, I don't need anything else. And Rena, he took his own pipe out. He said, and what about that? What about that on your back? Oh yeah, he says, I'd love that to be gone. The hump, I'd love that to be gone. I don't notice it much myself because I can't see it because it's behind me. But it might be nice to have it gone, because he wanted to please the king of the fairies. So Rena, he did his magic, and he said words that even John did not understand. But at the end of the words that he said that John did not understand, he said, Imaha, which means be gone. And the hump was gone. And John was lying on his back, looking up at the stars over the loch in Cork City. And then he pressed himself up from the ground with his elbows, dusted himself off, and stood up. And when he stood up, he said, Whoa, I'm very tall. In fact, John was over 6 foot tall, but he never knew it. He never knew that he was that tall. And he started to climb up the steps, and he came out onto the loch of Cork City. And he said, this is a beautiful place in a beautiful time. And he was filled with gratitude. And he started singing songs all through the streets of Cork City. And people were like, that John, it's the early hours of the morning and he's singing songs, but at least he can hold a tune. At least when John sings, you feel happy in your belly. And then he got home and he was still singing songs. Oh, Roche de Vahawalia, oh, Roche de Vahawalia, oh, Roche de Vahawalia, and his Sherhock Dan Taurig. He sang as he danced around the table, and Sean came down the stairs and said, who's this happy at this hour of the morning? Because John was so full of happiness, he told him the story of the night before. And he said, look at me, Sean, look at me. And because Sean's hump was pushing him down, he had to look up at him like that. And then he went, here, how are you standing so straight? Here, how are you standing so tall? And he said, didn't I just tell you? And he told him again, because he had great patience. I don't know if I'd have that patience. And this time, Sean listened with his 2 ears open wide, making a plan. And he said, tonight is my turn. I'm going to the pub and the moon is full and I'm going to do what you did. Look to you, he said. Look to you, my brother. Look, Lemograharka. Look to my brother, he said. And I hope you come home tomorrow with no hump on your back. But remember, you need to be polite. You need to smile at the king. You need to take your time. And Sean thought, I need nothing. And he went off to the pub, and the pub was empty. And he drank his pint down because there was nobody to interrupt him and sing songs with or do dances with. And his face was so cranky when he was leaving the pub. You'd think that he had no miracle to go and chase, but he was chasing a miracle. And he climbed up the hill where the stone wall was, and he thought, why do I have to climb up the hill? You'd think this would be on flat land. Hills. Who cares for hills? And he was giving out even in his own mind. And then he heard the fairies. He heard the fairies sing the magical song in their magical lilting way. Day Lewin, day Mort, day Lewin, day Mort, day Lewin, day Mort is day Cairdean. Day Lewin, day Mort, day Lewin, day Mort, day Lewin, day Mort is day Cairdean. And it sounded so happy that it nearly made Sean sick right there next to the stone wall, because he had never allowed himself to be happy. And he waited for the gap, and he waited, and to Sean it felt like he waited for a long time, when in fact he didn't wait that long at all. And over the heads of the fairies, before there was a gap in the session, he went, "De hina de sarin de ste donok." Oh. And then he said, "Wait a minute." And they Deirdre. And the little head came out across the wall and looked at him. And another little head, another little head, another little head, just like his brother had said. But they didn't look happy. They looked quite cross, and Sean was quite happy about the fact that they looked quite cross. And then they said, "Tarcuim, Tarcuim, Tarcuim." And they put the come hither on him, and he felt his legs going towards the lock, and he went, "Don't get my shoes wet now." And then he saw the lock beginning to separate, and he saw the stairs coming just as his brother had said. And then he felt himself floating towards the top of the stairs, and then boom, 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 right to the bottom of the stairs. He fell down every one of them steps, and the fairies to this day said it was his own fault for not tying his shoelaces. But I wonder if they helped him fall down all those stairs. And at the end of the stairs, Rena She was waiting, and they all spoke together to the king. The fairy said, and Rena She, he listened, sucking on his pipe, taking it all in. And he said, "Really, really?" And it happened that way. And all of the fairies said, "Sha," which means yes. And then he said, "What do you want from us, Sean? What do you want?" And Sean, with no manners whatsoever, said, "Well, I'll have some gold, and I'll have some jewels. I'll have a beautiful house. And would you mind getting rid of this hump?" And the king said, "Mind? Mind, is it? Mind getting rid of that hump?" And whoosh, Sean found himself flying up into the air, and poof, back down onto the ground. And he could hardly get up. Oh, can you guess what happened? Oh, he could hardly get up off the ground, because when he crashed into the ground, not only did he have his own hump, but he had John's hump too. And he struggled up the steps, and there was no sign of the gold, and there was no sign of the gems, and there was no sign of the humps being gone, and there was no sign of the she-folk, for they'd all gone away to their secret places. And he struggled out of the loch, and he was just getting to the edge of the loch when all the water splashed back, and his shoes got wet. And he said, "I told ye not to wet my shoes." And he tramped down the hills of Cork. Now, when he got as far as Fitzgerald's Park, he was so bent over, and his nose was so sharp, that it made a big furrow down through the field of Fitzgerald's Park. And they do say that that is how the plough was invented. So, children and big children, never mess with the fairies. Always be polite if you're in their company. So that is my stories of the brother Sean and John, and it was told very differently on the Joe Duffy Show of the 16th of March, which is on a podcast if you want to hear another version of it. Now let me see. I'm going to look to John. John, have I time for one more story?
There's always time for one more story. Make it the sort of and Louis off to swimming. So he's got his last swimming. Louis got his last swimming lesson before the Easter holidays.
Fantastic.
So if Louis disappears, it's not because he's ignoring you. He loves your stories, don't you, Louis?
I can see Louis in the car.
Yes, I do. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So,
Oh.
And
but
I
he's
gotta say, I love the story of John and Son. I love the story of John and Son. Just amazing story. I think
Oh.
I'm gonna read that out loud to my friends at school.
okay. Well, you can always catch the last.
And that's
If
what
you
in
miss
my
the
school.
last
So
story, you can always catch it on catch up. But Maria, could you give us one last story, please?
One last story, and I have to make it a short one. I heard that, John. So let me think. A last story. Did you ever hear of the white horses of the sea? I love them, you know. So when the waves are whoosh, crashing like that, they look like the heads of horses. And in the old stories, the stories from the Shandini, from the old people, they would say that they were the white horses of the seas, Coppel, Bawn and Mara. And they would say of those horses that they were not made of blood and muscle and sinew, but they were made of spirit and spray and sea. And there's a lovely singer. His name is John Spillane, and he lives in Passage West in Cork. And he often comes to the storytelling sessions, and he often comes to Cape Clear Island for the stories in Cape Clear off the coast of Cork. And he sings a song called the 100 Snow White Horses, and it's about the Coppelbaw and the Mara. And this story is about Passage West and how there was a girl there who called back the Coppelbawn. Can you remember how to call them? Do you know how to call the Coppelbawn? Because people forget. If they don't practice, they forget. And even though Ireland is a wet and windy country today, there's no chink of light, no rainbow here. There was a time when the sun shone so long and so strong that the tar in the streets of Cork melted, and when people stood on it, they could see their footprint in the tar itself. And at that time, the people, they were choking for the want of a drink of water, even though they lived near the sea, for the sea is salty. And they wanted the rain to come, this beautiful soft rain. You wouldn't believe it today now, but they called for the rain. Oh, please, sky, please rain down a little bit, they cried. But the sky didn't listen, for they'd forgotten how to call the Coppelbawn. They'd forgotten that they might need them once again. They forgot that they might need 100 of the snow white horses to make it rain over Cork City. And this little girl, she had a dream. She had a dream, and deep in the dream, she heard the words that would be needed to call the Coppelbawn. I told them to you. I told them to you in a story just before these stories. Can you remember? In English, it's come to me, come to me. But the Coppelbawn and Mara, named in Irish, would only respond to it in Irish. Can you remember the magic words, the focal driachta that would call the horses? Looking in the notes, I'm not seeing it come, so I'll tell you once more, and I'll remind you to listen to them, to soak it all in. Tarcuim, Tarcuim, Coppelbawn Amara, Tarcuim. Come to me, white horses of the sea, come to me. Tarcuim, Tarcuim, Coppelbawn Amara, Tarcuim. And she walked a little bit out into the sea, into the inlet that is coming up towards Passage West, and she started to call, and her voice was low, like the child's voice. But when her mother heard her calling, she followed her into the river. Tarcuing, Tarcuing, Coppelbawn Amara, Tarcuing, said her mother, and then her father, and then every people in the village of Passage West joined them right there in the river, and a black cloud started to come down through the inlet, and under the cloud, all the waves, the heads of the white horses crashing into the inlet, galloping down that inlet that's normally so peaceful, bringing the rains with them, and the people clapped, and never again did they forget the words that would call the white horses of the sea to them. A nice short one.
But beautifully formed.
Oh,
Small but beautifully formed.
thank you. I just saw Emer, and I promised Emer that if she came, she could tell a story. I'm sorry, Emer, I didn't see you in time. Next time.
Have
No
have
worries.
actually have I got Emma? I'm sure I've got Emma somewhere. You're have I got you back? Have I scheduled you back in for next month sometime?
Yes,
or
the 28th of April.
I thought so. Because I sent the schedule through for April, and that's Waleed is putting up on Monday.
Okay.
So then, but I knew I'd put your name down for some time. I couldn't remember. So you'll have a whole night. You'll have a whole night. So
No
you're
worries.
fine.
Delighted just to be here anyway.
But and Maria's story is wonderful.
Absolutely. As always, as always.
As always, we would expect nothing less.
Of course.
But the what we got coming up? Well, there's no worldwide story round this Sunday. It starts on the 2nd, and the important thing to know is that it's going to start. We're going back to a 6 o'clock start for the worldwide story round. We only had it for the winter at that 7 o'clock, and it was just more convenient for people in the winter. So next Tuesday, of course, we have our young international tellers. So if anyone's got that, and that's 5 o'clock in the evening. Remember, the clocks change this weekend. So if anyone's got any young tellers under the age of 25 in their back pocket, bring them along, and sort of it's definitely a young person's open mic, and the exams are over in India, are finished in India. So we've got our young Indian storytellers back, which is marvelous, and we've got a young lady from Italy who's giving us Juha stories that she's got from her. She's from Italy, but she's got a Moroccan grandmother or a Moroccan mother, and so she's got Juha stories that she's getting from her grandmother. So they've never been published. These are stories that have been passed on truly in the oral tradition. And those stories she's getting them from her mother, but her mother got them from her mother. So that's marvelous. And so we've got this real link with Morocco coming there through continental Europe, through to Morocco, which I think is amazing and fantastic, through our young tellers. So what we got next Friday, we have someone totally new on, Carolyn Emerson, who's a puppeteer, storyteller and puppeteer. So she's sort of environmentalist. So she has these tippity twig, and she has puppets that are made from things she finds in the woods. That would be interesting. It'd be nice to have a new voice. I think you were the last new voice, really new voice we had on. So next month you'll be a veteran, especially after Marrakesh, of course. And then on the 2nd of April will be our next worldwide. But Monday it'll all be up in the schedule by the end of Monday. So, but meanwhile, thank you, Waleed, for flying the magic carpet. Thank you, Maria, for giving us some fantastic stories, and thank you, Mike, Amir, and Norman for being and Robin and Autumn, of course, for being our our online live audience. And all of you out on Facebook land or Vimeo or YouTube, wherever, however you're listening, have a wonderful week. We'll see you either Tuesday or Friday. For now,
John,
bye-bye, and
just before you go, can you tell everyone your brother's name, please?
oh, Sean. Well, we